for real.
Let's do this.
It's a ninja legend. When a long sword is on top of a short sword and covered with a red cloth, it means a challenge. No one can turn down the challenge. You're going to accept the challenge? You are a ninja, aren't you?
Hello, I'm Sabrina, aka Bria, aka the artist of the popular transgender-themed webcomic Life of Bria, and now apparently that qualifies me to have a radio show. Today marks the 5th show of the series, and already so early in the game, I've been honored to have on an incredible roster of interesting and distinguished guests. Not only is today's guest no exception to that, but I do, in fact, believe she may be my most distinguished guest to date. And I'm kind of blown away that she agreed to talk to a lowly webcomic artist like myself. I'm extremely lucky to have on the show with me biologist, trans feminist scholar, spoken word artist, musician, and author of numerous books, both fiction and non-fiction, including Whipping Girl, a transsexual woman on sexism and the scapegoating of femininity, Excluded, making feminist and queer movements more inclusive, and now her new book, Outspoken, a decade of transgender activism and transfeminism. Please welcome to the show the legend herself, Julia Serano. Julia, thank you so much for joining me.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, as a prominent thinker on issues surrounding feminism, sexuality, and gender studies, I'm sure there's a lot of readers of your work out there who are just dying to know, what is your favorite dinosaur?
When I was a kid, it was Triceratops. I haven't thought about the issue in quite a while, but Triceratops is my favorite dinosaur growing up. Although I have parrots, I have conure family parrots, and parrots being birds are dinosaurs. So I guess they would probably be my favorite current dinosaurs, but my favorite past dinosaur is Triceratops.
That's very interesting, because not only did my first guest on the show, who I'd mentioned before, Carla Lewis, she has parrots, and she answered the same thing, because I think people who have parrots just love their parrots. I found, though, many guests, they either fall into Camp Triceratops or Camp Tyrannosaurus. I'm Camp Tyrannosaurus. It's pretty clear to me which is the cooler dinosaur, but I think Camp Triceratops is also respectable. I always ask every guest that question of what their favorite dinosaur is, because I really do think it actually helps give a lot of insight into who they are and what they value in life and their identity and just like their personalities. And this actually kind of leads me to something you've written about before, is the common accusation that people have towards, LGBTQ people, especially trans people and bisexual people, that we're somehow lying about who we are. Why do you think people have such a hard time accepting at face value that somebody could be different from them and how they think they should be?
Yeah, I think a big problem is that we all come into the world and we learn things or absorb things or internalize things in the culture that we end up taking for granted, and we believe that that's just how the world is. And I think that often when people are confronted by anyone or anything that seems to challenge their worldview, their first knee-jerk reaction often is to assume that this thing can't be real. And so I think that that's why people who, most of us grow up into worlds that are very heteronormative, and there are these ideas about women are like this and men are like that. And so as soon as someone comes along who challenges your way of thinking, a lot of times people want to believe that, oh, well, being gay or trans or bisexual, that's not a real thing. You must really fill in the blank. And they'll always come up with some kind of ulterior motive or some kind of weird idea they have as to why we are who we are. And it is very endlessly frustrating for those of us who find ourselves in that situation, not just for being gender or sexual minorities, but that can happen for other things. If you are different from your culture with regards to your other beliefs, or it happens a lot with religion. A lot of times people assume that people who have religious beliefs or lack thereof that differ from the mainstream, they'll assume that something must be wrong with you. So I think that this is just a common problem in the world.
I suppose people don't like being challenged in what they identify as, and if they see somebody who's different than who they are, they worry it's like an attack. Oh, if you're not like me, it must mean you think this other thing is better. So you're saying you're better than me, and I'm somehow wrong. It's unfortunate that people can't just, I don't know, accept that other people aren't quite like them.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of us who are under the LGBTQ plus umbrella, yeah. I think that a lot of the problems we have is that people see, the average person sees like men and women as opposites, and there's just this assumption that everyone falls neatly into one of those two camps, and those two camps are going to be attracted to each other and all these things, so that if you are different in any way, not only do you fall outside of their ideas of how the world should work, but a lot of times people feel that our existence challenges who they are, right? So if you're, say someone who hasn't really questioned gender, and then you meet a transgender person or find a transgender person attractive, or, someone you're dating turns out to be bisexual, it seems in people's minds that it somehow impacts them. Like, they're like, yeah. Well, what does that mean about me? When who we are has nothing to do with who anyone else is. And it takes a lot of people have a hard time understanding that.
I often wonder, though, how many of these people, they're dealing with anything. It could be that they're gay or trans or anything like that, but even just some aspect of themselves that they don't like, or they would like to change but are not able to, and they see people who are living their truth and who've made change in their life, and it triggers them, and that's why they lash out. If you ever, what would be your thinking on that sort of motive? I just assume it, but...
Yeah, I mean, that definitely, without a doubt, happens. I've known a lot of people who are kind of queer people who have told me that, yeah, I was that person. Like, before I came out, I was really, really kind of homophobic or transphobic. And there definitely can be a defense mechanism where sometimes the people who kind of attack us the most have something they're dealing with themselves. But I don't think that that's necessarily the only reason. I think a lot of times people can have just ideological beliefs that lead them to be homophobic or transphobic, even if they don't have their own gender or sexual issues going on in the background.
For
so
sure.
It can happen, definitely, though.
Yeah. But I guess really the question I have to ask you now is, are you lying about your favorite dinosaur, Julia? It challenges my beliefs.
I answered the question without thinking about it. So, but I did say that I haven't reinvestigated it in a while. So I never really thought as to why I like Triceratops more than Tyrannosaurus.
Does that mean you're cis-dinosaur then?
Is that what?
Or does it mean you're cis-dinosaur then? You never had to undergo a process of dinosaur transition. You just took it at face value from...
That's right. That must have been the case.
Does that make it more valid or less valid? Have to ask a dinosaur turf on that.
Yeah, I'm going to go to bed tonight lying in bed thinking about, well, why did I like Triceratops more than Tyrannosaurus?
And are you marginalizing people who like...
It might have been an underdog thing. I don't know. I can understand it. I just thought Triceratops was more cool. It had the 3 horns. Mm-hmm. Some animals only have 1 or 2 horns. They had 3. That seemed cool. So maybe it has something to do with the number 3. I don't know.
I read too much into people's dinosaur, preferences. I imagine, though, people who like Triceratops, they like that it's not going around killing other dinosaurs. It's just looking out for itself, protecting itself for its baby. It's defensive. It's not this aggressive predator. These all sorts of things you could read into it, I'm sure. But it's a perfectly respectable camp. But I guess while we're on the topic of, just these different identities and, people feeling like there's us and them, a lot of cisgender heterosexual people have this somewhat naive idea, though, that the whole LGBTQ or TQ, plus community is one big happy family and we all get along and support each other. But many of us, especially in the trans community, know from experience that isn't always the case. And your second book, Excluded, is about making these different movements and spaces more inclusive. What were some of the main issues in the community that led you to write that book?
Yeah, so and I would say that I really came out. I had some involvement in trans communities in the '90s, but I really kind of came out into queer communities and transgender communities in the early zeros or aughts. I prefer zeros over aughts.
I've never heard that
and
before.
yeah, and over like kind of my initial years being in those communities, I found that there are all these strange within the community hierarchies. So, for example, the one that gets talked about a lot is how basically lesbian and gay are seen as like the top of the pecking order, and people who are transgender or bisexual or other categories, whether you're asexual or intersex and so on, we're kind of the letters that are farther down in the acronym. So that's one dynamic. But I also found that within some transgender communities, there were people who would insist that, people who were kind of genderqueer or visibly gender nonconforming were kind of better or more transgressive than, say, someone, a transsexual who fits fairly neatly into the binary post-transition. Or sometimes some people do it vice versa. Some people will say, well, I'm a real transsexual, where you're just merely a transgender, that kind of stuff. And I became really, and another issue that I talk about in Whipping Girl, but I also kind of applied, was the way in which feminine gender expression within a lot of queer spaces was looked down upon, whereas masculine gender expression was seen as more transgressive and kind of not questioned as much. And so all those things led me and excluded to think about and to try to come up with answers for why do we always tend to create these hierarchies with
are you there?
Marginalized communities, and what can we do? Like, what are some ways that we can prevent that from happening in the future? And so that's, especially in the second half of the book, I kind of forward a lot of my thinking about that.
And in the years since it was published, would you say a lot of progress has been made on this front? Because, I mean, I wasn't around when you would have first started it, and not in the community. Have you seen a visible change?
I definitely think that there's a lot more attention paid nowadays to making these spaces more inclusive, or at least a lot of talk about it. But I still think that the problems still persist. I mean, every single day of my life, especially even days where I don't even leave my apartment, but I'm on social media, and I will see people expressing their experiences of how they, as someone who's bisexual, just had their identity dismissed by someone who is gay identified, or trans people of various types feeling like their trans identity isn't taken as seriously as another person's trans identity. So I think that these problems still exist. I don't think that they've gotten better, but I do think there's more conversation about trying to make communities more inclusive. But I think that there's a lot of difficult personal work that we all have to do that's involved in it. One of the ideas that I talk about in Excluded, I bring it up in Whipping Girl a bit, is I talk about gender entitlement, which is basically the way in which we tend to project our own beliefs about gender and sexuality onto other people. And we often, and this goes back to what the conversation, how our conversation started, what we were saying a couple minutes ago, and how people tend to hold their own views about gender and sexuality over the way other people experience their own genders and sexualities. And I think that the way, people talk about, let's shatter the gender binary or overthrow the patriarchy, and those sound cool because they're obvious, like, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys type of situations. Whereas gender entitlement, I think we all, to a certain degree, have certain expectations and assumptions that we hold people to that we probably shouldn't. And so a lot of the work that we have to do is to kind of challenge the way that we've been trained to see the world, and to be more truly accepting of difference, rather than just saying, oh yeah, we want our organization to be diverse, to actually think about, like, how is it that the assumptions and expectations that we ourselves have might make it more difficult for somebody else to enter the space.
I think this is very common. I mostly see it because I'm mostly involved with the trans community. There's so many transgender and transsexual people who, you know, I guess the what's it called, trust scum, where they're thinking people who do not medically transition or take hormones or surgery or anything, they are not valid. But, like, how can they not see that their arguments they're using are almost the exact same ones that, say, cis hetero people would use against trans people to invalidate our identities? Like, how can they not see that they're just making the exact same mistakes and doing the exact same things to other people? It's very troubling to see that within the community.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree, and I think that this is more of a, I mean, we can talk about, well, let's put it this way, as, like, trans activists, we might talk about the gender binary and how we need to raise awareness about it and the problems that it creates in people's lives, and, you know, try to get people to realize that the gender binary has all these problems associated with it. And that is a way of carrying out our activism. But I think that there's a broader problem, which is that I think we live in a culture that, in addition to having gender binaries and patriarchies and, you know, racism and classism and ableism and all these different isms, I think there's also a more general tendency for us to hold double standards where we see and treat people and interpret people differently, and where we tend, because of those double standards, to create hierarchies where people are always trying to position themselves as being better than other people. And I don't see any reason why we need any types of, you know, hierarchies, or why we need to have somebody else, like, to undermine somebody else in order for us to have a more advantaged position. And I think that is a more general thing that even a lot of people who are activists still will sometimes, you know, do that, try to claim that either, oh, I'm more radical than you, or I'm more respectable than you. And I think that it's really important to address these general hierarchies, in addition to challenging all the different isms that we need to challenge.
One thing that absolutely resonates with me about your work is that it doesn't seem like you're very completely on board with this idea that gender is strictly a performance, and instead you have proposed your own replacement model as a source for gender. What do you think is so attractive to the idea of gender as performance for queer scholars, and what led you ultimately to, it seems like, mostly reject it in your work?
Yeah, so and for people out there who maybe aren't as familiar with it, the idea that if you hear the phrases all genders drag or all genders performance, these were really popular kind of queer slogans that came out of the 90s.
Oh yeah, that was in university for me, for sure. That's what they talked about. Like, that's all they talked about in my classes. Anytime gender came up, it was always performative.
Yeah, and so there's a difference. So these are often attributed to Judith Butler, who never said either of those phrases. But Judith Butler did put forward an idea of about gender being performative, which in her mind is different from gender's just a performance, and she's critiqued the idea that gender's just a performance. Her idea of gender being performative just refers to the fact that it's something that in our interactions with people, it's always being cited. You know, like, people will say, you know, excuse me, ma'am, and I'll turn around, and in a way I'm basically being, you know, brought into a conversation as a gendered subject. And so anyway, so she has this very and if you haven't read her work is very dense, but there's a lot of smart ideas that are in there. But anyway, the way that kind of ended up permeating a lot of queer communities was the idea that, you know, all genders drag, all genders performance, which I think resonates with a lot of people in that it kind of implies that gender is just this artificial thing, and if gender is this artificial thing, that means we can do our genders any way we want to do them. And I think in the 90s, during the time when that was coming out and going into the zeros, which these phrases were very common in the zeros when I was coming to trans communities. People would throw them around, and it would be self-empowering for some people. But then I had people say to me, well, I don't see why you have to transition. Don't you understand that gender is just a performance?
Yes.
Yeah. And so that led me to, in some of my writings, and especially in Excluded, to challenge this idea that gender is just a performance. And I would say instead that what gender is it's this holistic thing. Like saying gender is just a performance is like saying gender is just socialization, or gender is just genitals, or gender is just, fill in the blank. Like, I think that gender is all those things. I think that's part of what makes it really, really complicated. It's all these, we can talk about gender being a performance, but that doesn't explain why, when I was a young child, I inexplicably kind of had this sense that there was something wrong with me being a boy and that I should be a girl. And I didn't know where that came from, right? There's an inexplicable quality. For a lot of us, our genders and sexualities are profoundly held. And sure, we throughout our lives can experiment with our genders and sexualities, and I don't...
Oh dear, are you there?
I think that a lot of times... Yeah, can you hear me?
Now I can, yes. It just
Hello?
cut out for a sec. Yeah, can you hear me? Good.
Yeah, okay, sorry.
Awesome.
We glitched out there. But I think that gender is just this whole holistic thing of all these, different intrinsic inclinations that we might have, and then all these social pressures and how we respond and react to all that. And I think that I also think that with regards to, people like to talk about nature versus nurture with regards to gender and sexuality. I think it's very clearly both. Mm-hmm. And I think it's very clearly impossible for us to untangle, what is happening where, right? I have no idea why I'm trans, and I'm sure that there is likely some biological aspects to it and also some social aspects to it. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in a world where I was assigned a particular gender and I was socialized that gender, and that didn't work for me. So there are social things as well as probably biological things going on. And I think by thinking about genders as being this holistic thing, it allows us to not basically, if gender is this really complex, holistic thing, then we should embrace the fact that gender diversity will exist, rather than saying to people, oh, well, don't you know that gender is just a performance? You don't have to be a transsexual, or you don't have to do this. So I think that embracing the fact that people are going to fall all over the map with regards to gender and sexuality allows us to move beyond kind of creating like hierarchies and pecking orders about what genders or sexualities are better or worse, and instead just focus on challenging all forms of sexism, which I would say is any double standard related to a person's sex, gender, or sexuality.
I mean, hopefully that would be pretty straightforward for a lot of people. It's amazing how few people get it. It's like there's these things that clearly, I guess, must be, I guess you could say, a construct of performance, like, say, the idea that all women wear dresses or only women wear dresses. Like, there's no way that's a biological component. But, when we have trans people who we feel were this particular gender, like, as early as, like, 4 years old, like, that's this deep sense inside yourself that I'm a girl. And I want to wear dresses not because I've got some DNA or something that says it's the dress DNA for being a girl. It's I want to do the things that in this culture we live in, girls do, because I'm a girl too. And you do it on principle. Same with also the washroom thing, the people fighting for our right to use the washroom we want to use, even though many of us think the idea of sex-segregated washrooms are completely backward. On principle, if you're accepting me as a woman, as long as you're segregating the bathrooms by sexes, I'm getting segregated with all the other women. And you not letting me go in there is you saying I'm not a woman too, which is not okay. And it's just kind of difficult. Like, I can't believe that people wouldn't be able to grasp that there is a performance and a construct, but there is also this intrinsic thing within us that says to us who we are. Male, female, or non-binary, you've got this in you. And that's okay.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, I think that the people use the performance when they want to use the performance, sometimes against other people, like, exactly what you're saying. There's just because, a dress in and of itself doesn't mean anything. Having long or short hair doesn't in and of itself mean anything. But in a culture where we do assign meanings and symbolism and connotations, particular aspects of gender expression, then those forms of gender expression, while not necessarily intrinsically male or female, they take on importance. And none of us can live completely outside of society. That, so just because some of these things seem to be arbitrary, and that does not necessarily mean that they don't have any personal meaning to individuals.
People seem to get extremely defensive, though, when you try to give even a partially biological explanation for some behavior. And, I mean, you're a biologist, too, of course, so you would be knowledgeable on this. Why do you think it is that people dislike biological explanations for things?
I think people dislike biological explanations for things because biological explanations are often used by the straight mainstream in order to pathologize us. Being a biologist, biology is very, very complex, and any biologist will tell you that when you're talking about any kind of complex behavior, that there's going to be a mixture of biology and socialization and environment that are all coming together. That's kind of a given in biology. However, some people have used really, really what might be called like gender essentialists or biological determinist arguments to kind of imply that, it's all genes and hormones that basically make men and women so different from each other, and they can use it in a way that basically either erases or pathologizes people who are atypical or non-conforming with regards to their genders and their sexualities. And because people have used biology against us, there are some people within feminism and queer and trans activism who kind of have a knee-jerk negative reaction to raising the idea of biology at all. But I would counter that biology is actually creates a lot of diversity, and in that chapter of Excluded where I talk about this, I list all the different aspects of biology that are more about creating diversity than are essentialist in nature. But the second thing is that the idea that gender is just all social constructs and socialization has also been used to hurt us.
Yes.
Right? It's the idea that gender is all socialization, which is what would lead people like Ken Zucker to carry out gender reparative therapies on young gender nonconforming children. Or John Money, he was a psychologist who way back pioneered the idea of what now is considered horrible, the idea of he believed that gender was all socialization, and so he advocated for using non-consensual gender assignment for intersex children. So basically deciding what sex category that child was going to live in without their consent. And that had a lot of horrible ramifications on a lot of people's lives. And so that has been done purely out of the idea that gender is just socialization. So I think if you believe either of those two extremes, you can create really rigid ways of seeing the world that hurt a lot of people. Whereas if you believe that they come together in an unfathomably complex way to create gender diversity, then all people's gender experiences are valid to a certain degree, and as long as what you're doing isn't impinging on other people or non-consensually affecting other people, then we should accept the fact that people are going to fall all over the map with regards to gender.
One thing that's always bothered me about most ideas people have around biology and nature is the idea that anything that's in nature must innately be good. So if you give a biological explanation for it, it's like you're saying you're justifying something, but like nothing in nature is intrinsically good or bad. It just kind of is. So I don't know, if you give a biological explanation for a thing, you're not trying to say, yeah, we should do this thing or something. I mean, it just, this is what caused it, but we're going to act the way we want to act in the context that this is the cause of this. I mean, there's, a lot of evidence of like cannibalism is pretty common in nature, but we've all pretty much agreed it's not okay because nobody wants to be eaten, so when you try and give explanations for a lot of things within nature, people, they freak out. It's like you're saying it's okay. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that goes both ways. I think people often invoke nature or biology when they want to make something that they think is good seem natural, right?
Yes.
So if you think, like all people should be cisgender and heterosexual, then you will invoke biology to say, well, this is how nature made us, right?
Exactly.
But then there can be situations like you were describing where just because something is biological doesn't mean that it's okay, right? And yeah, there's plenty of examples in the vast human history to say that things like, war and slavery and cannibalism and all these things have occurred many, many times in society, and maybe they have like natural origins or biological origins, but that doesn't mean that that's an excuse for us to like have those things in our culture. Like I think that just because something is natural doesn't mean that it's automatically good. So,
for sure. So you have your new book, Outspoken, A Decade of Transgender Activism and Transfeminism, which comes out November 9th, yes? That's what I sort of saw on your site.
Yes, it's coming out by November 9th.
Okay.
It may sneak out there before then. So basically I'm in the very last stages of kind of behind the scenes getting it ready. So it's already been proofed and everything.
Awesome.
And I picked November 9th on purpose because it's the day after the U.S. election. And right now, that's for obvious, understandable reasons, kind of consuming everything, all the news and all the social media. I decided to start promoting the book after the election.
Clever girl.
So yes. So when you're finally done with hearing the day in, day out slog of all the horrible news related to the election, then you can go on Amazon and you can buy a copy of my book.
It's
not
smart.
up there now, but if you go to my website, on the sidebar, there'll be a picture of the book and there'll be a page there, and I will basically let people know on that page once the book is officially out.
I'll link all that stuff in the description of this video when it's posted. But to keep talking about the book, I understand it's a collection of your previously unpublished writings. Is that correct?
Yeah, so some of them have appeared elsewhere before, but they're scattered across the internet. And then a lot of them are previously unpublished or were published way back, but now they're published in things that are now out of print. And basically, the impetus for this was when I was working on Excluded, there were a bunch of essays in the very beginning, personal essays, spanning a bunch of years where I was talking about experiences of exclusion, and I didn't have room in that book for all of them. And then I started going through my computer, and I just found all these pieces. I had all these old spoken word pieces and slam poems from the early zeros, when I was mostly doing slam poetry. And then I had some leftover pieces, including 2 chapters that I wrote for Whipping Girl but never made it into the book. And I have a bunch of blog pieces that have appeared at various points in time, but being the way that the internet is created in such a way that it's always easiest to find new material, and a lot of older blog posts from, say, 5 years ago or 7 years ago, while they still have relevance, are really difficult to find. So this gave me the opportunity to put, and this isn't like everything that I've done outside of my 2 books, but it's basically 48 pieces that I'm all really proud about that span different eras. And the book is set up into 5 different parts, and each part kind of is a different era for me. And also, one of the things that really became obvious as I was putting this together is that each of these different eras, so much has changed in the last like 10 to 15 years with regards to not just progress trans communities have made, but also within communities, like what we're talking about, or how people feel about the different issues, or the language that we use. All of that has changed a lot over the last 10 to 15 years. And so by putting in these different parts, and I have introductions to each part to kind of talk about what was going on in my mind and life, and what was going on in trans communities and in society at large, that led to the pieces that I created during that time. So yes, I'm really excited to finally have all these pieces together and to be able to put them out into the world.
That's great. I've been looking over, you've got the table of contents on your website, and there's quite a bit covered in the book, as you say. What would you think are like the core ideas that you'd say are most important that you have in it?
Well, I mean, I could say what the 5 different parts are.
Mm-hmm.
The first part is basically a lot of my old slam poetry, and that was more about, as someone who was kind of coming out into trans communities, and when I was performing slam poetry, again, this is like 2002, 2003, just being a visible trans person then, I mean, it's still true now, but just being a visible trans person then was kind of like a big deal. And so a lot of those pieces are about me just telling my personal stories, and my personal relation to gender, and also challenging people. My cat is trying to jump on the computer. Okay. Sorry. So anyway, those are kind of like pieces that were maybe a little more personal. The second part is called Articulating Trans Misogyny, which are a lot of pieces that were either just before, during, or after me writing Whipping Girl, and talking about some of the ideas in that book. Part 3 is about, it's a collection of writings, most of which were written regarding the latest DSM revision that happened between 2008 and around 2013. The DSM is, for those who don't know, it's what people call the psychiatric Bible. It has all the diagnoses. And so I wrote a bunch of pieces about trans-related diagnoses that were both being considered and then ended up in the DSM. And then the fourth part is a collection of pieces that were right around the time I was working on Excluded, and so we talked about Excluded a bit, some of the ideas related to some of the ideas that were in that book. And then the last part is all pieces that are about discussing differences that exist within trans communities. And I've become a big believer that we always, as activists, we want to act like we're right and other people are wrong. But a lot of times it's just that we have different views, or we have different goals, slightly different goals. And it's a lot of the pieces are more about explaining why people have different views than it is advocating for any specific view. And that was definitely influenced by my work on Excluded. Just again, this idea of basically accepting other people for who they are, and trying to, even if we don't agree on everything, trying to not undermine other people's experiences or perspectives in the process.
That goes back to what we were talking about before, of other people and what they're doing doesn't really affect you most of the time. Somebody identifying differently from you is not a big deal. Someone being gender non-conforming doesn't undermine someone being a binary trans person or a cis heterosexual person. It's you be you, I'll be me, and it's okay.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's, again, like it seems like a pretty basic thing, especially in the society. You know, you're in the States, I'm in Canada, but both are very much talking about freedom, the pursuit of happiness, and there's people who really, really just don't want other people to be happy if it means they're different from they are.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's again, it's a shame that a lot of people feel like in order for me to be good, other people have to be bad. It's a shame
Yeah.
that people, for me to be on top, someone else has to be below me. It's a shame that we tend to think that way, and I think that that's, really, really crucial to address in order to create communities and activist movements that are genuinely inclusive.
I was quite interested in the chapter I saw there on reconceptualizing autogynephilia. Would you care to first, I guess, explain what autogynephilia is for listeners who aren't familiar with it, and then just how you address it in the book? Because I'm sure you've got some very important points about it.
Sure. And actually, so that is one of the pieces, if people were to Google that, there's a blog post that basically the chapter in the book is based on, although the book will have a couple extra additional chapters in it. Autogynephilia is a theory that was put out by a psychologist named Ray Blanchard in the 1980s, that his theory was that there are two types of trans women. Basically, there are those who are solely attracted to men, who he described as being homosexual transsexuals, which is very confusing nomenclature.
Yeah.
But then he thought that lesbian, bisexual, and asexual trans women, he thought that they all formed a completely different group of trans women, and he called them autogynephiles, based on the fact, a correlation that group often at some point in their lives have had fantasies or erotic thoughts about being female or feminine. And he believed that the latter group constituted a paraphilia, which is kind of like a fancy way of saying like having an abnormal sexuality. And so anyway, so he put out this theory. It has been for obvious reasons picked up by a lot of kind of enemies of trans people, to basically sexualize trans women and to use it. Some have used it in a way that kind of plays into stereotypes of trans women as sexual predators that you see in kind of like, these bathroom bills and a lot of the justification for those. But anyway, Blanchard's theory, there was lots of evidence that it was wrong. I, a few years ago, wrote a piece for an academic journal, and there's another person, Charles Moser, who also wrote a review, basically showing that his theory is false, right? But the problem is that the type of fantasy or erotic thought is something that some, not just trans people, but it turns out that Charles Moser did research on cisgender women and found that if he gave cisgender women Blanchard's test, that up to 90% of them would come out as autogynephiles, according to Blanchard's test. So obviously there's a phenomenon here, and in that piece, in that chapter, I give my I refer to these fantasies. Since the theory is wrong, I don't think it's right to call it autogynephilia anymore. But I refer to it as female or feminine embodiment fantasies. And so I give some of my ideas about why these fantasies tend to occur more often in certain groups of people than other groups of people. Some of this is related to the fact that we live in a culture where, women and femininity are seen as like the sexual objects, in kind of a world where there's a male gaze and people kind of have a, hetero-male centric view of sexuality. I think that those of us who are female or those of us who are feminine, to some degree internalize this or have some experience where the fact that those aspects of ourselves have kind of erotic potential, whereas, even though, say, masculine men may still think about their bodies during sex, like they may imagine something happening with their penis or doing something or having other people do something with their body, they don't like eroticize that aspect. so that's one of the reasons, and then there are a couple of other reasons that I think also play into it, play a role in the phenomenon. So people can look that up, and if they eventually get the book, they can get an even a little more thorough explanation on top of that.
Interesting. I'd actually done a comic about this some months ago, based just mostly on my own experiences, because surprise, surprise, I fit into the category of girls who, basically fantasized sexually about being female before in my old life when I didn't get to be the real me. And I thought for a long time that did, what's the word? Undermine my capacity as being a real trans person. And I just sort of explored it, also based on talking to other trans women, just this idea that the real you is so suppressed and you don't ever get to be her. You don't feel terribly comfortable in any other form of sexuality. And it almost is like such a hair trigger of never being actually sexually satisfied as a woman, because you don't get to be a woman, that even just thinking about being a woman becomes sexually arousing, because it's like you've never gotten off before. You don't get satisfied. Like, imagine if a guy was in a chastity belt and never ever had sex. How easy would it be to get him aroused? And I remember being very easily aroused with that. Sorry for too much information there, but it's this thing that it's almost, and it's largely gone away, by the way, folks. When you transition, oftentimes this is something that subsides more or less. You're able to be the real you, and you're able to express your sexuality, like a normal person, whatever that is. But I think a lot of it is coming from being repressed and being forced to be repressed by others. And it gets held against us, of course, in the end. And I guess it's a sore spot for me.
Yeah, no, definitely. And the reason why I refer to it as embodiment fantasies is because I think people who are having any kind of sexual fantasy that involves, more than one person, your own body is going to be a part of that fantasy. Mm-hmm. But for most cisgender people, they don't tend to think about their own body to the same degree. Whereas when you are a trans person who basically identifies, with the sex other than the one that you're assigned at birth or that you currently have, then, of course,
yeah,
a big part of the fantasy is going to be about being in the right body. And like you said, and it's been shown in the research that's been done that a lot of times these fantasies either greatly reduce or completely go away after the person has transitioned and they're at a point where they feel right in their body.
Yeah, sexuality, so much of it is not just who you go to bed with, but it's who you go to bed as. And it's really hard to be okay with sex if you're the wrong person in the partnering. And it's something a lot of cis people seem to have a hard time wrapping their heads around. And I don't know, it's a very strange thing we get put through.
Yeah. And then another reason why I've written a lot about this is because of the fact that, we live in a world where if you start talking about somebody's sexuality, that can be done in a way that, sexualizes them or slut shames them. Right?
Yeah.
And I think that it's really important to have conversations about our sexuality, but the way that autogynephilia has been used as a way for other people to invoke it as a way, like I've referred to autogynephilia as, basically, it's like transgender slut shaming.
Absolutely.
Right? It's like, all sorts of people have all sorts of sexual fantasies, and we should have sex positive discussions about that, but we shouldn't have sex negative discussions about other people's sexualities.
And of course, it's no coincidence that this fell into, in the original definition, the trans women who are attracted to man, they're the real ones, because of course women are only attracted to men. Lesbians aren't real, say. Or, it's always about, it has to be centered around the men and heterosexuality, and anything else outside of that has got to be some kind of weird thing, right? It's a little interesting, that coincidence there.
Yeah, a little more than a coincidence, yes, agreed.
So, women born women. That's women spelled with a Y, folks. Not the misogynistic E. This is essentially the war cry of anti-trans feminists and lesbian groups for their criteria of excluding transgender women from their discourse and their events. And you write about it in a few of your writings I've seen. How do you feel about that term? And are you among those people, as I've talked to a few, who believe transgender women can and should be included under that definition of womanhood?
Yeah, yeah. So well, for one thing, women-born women, when people invoke it, it's usually to say that, like, you know, women who are assigned female at birth are welcome, but women who are not assigned female at birth are not welcome. So, like, that phraseology, I don't, you know, I feel that those policies are problematic.
Yes.
The way in which they exclude trans women. As far as the word women with the Y, that's definitely a word that some feminists have embraced. Others have not. I personally don't use it in my writings, but I definitely think that women with the Y can and should include trans women. If trans women want to be see themselves as women with the Y, I think that that's totally fine. But yeah, my problems are more with trans women exclusion. You know, we feminists have been fighting for a very long time to say that, you know, women are more than just, you know, kind of, you know, the sex they were assigned and socialized. And many feminists have talked about how even though they were raised to be a certain type of girl, that they grew up to become a autonomous woman who doesn't let other people define her. And the idea that, given that people would use women-born women to basically objectify trans women's bodies, insinuate that we can't be anything more than, like, the gender we were socialized as, is really at its core anti-feminist.
Bit of a double standard there too. It's the reason why I guess I bring it up, the idea that trans women, I was actually just recently that I saw somebody writing about it, and it kind of clicked with me that trans women are women-born women, because we're born women. We have this mind, this thing inside us that tells us from a young age that we're actually female. And just because you were assigned the wrong sex at birth doesn't mean you weren't born the correct sex, just nobody else clued in. And so, yeah, we are so too women-born women. We just also then had to live in a prison for all these years. I actually I guess I'm bringing up my comics a fair bit here. I did a comic making fun of this. It was a woman pop culture character raised by wolves. She wasn't a real woman because she would, you know, not have been socialized as one. She was socialized as a wolf. Does that count? Is Tarzan not a real man? Or Mowgli? It's, I don't know. It just seems like they're kind of bending over backwards to be mean to us.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's just, I can't think of anything that, like, to box woman, like, a woman is what she was born as. Like, that is just weird. That is straightforward weird. I think what a woman is a woman is someone who identifies as a woman and moves through the world as a woman, which I've done for over 15 years. And, you know, I did have a male socialization, but basically once you start living as a woman, all that changes. People don't read you that way anymore. I may have had male privileges in the past, but I am not granted those anymore. And I face sexism. I have had to deal with catcalls. That I think that what feminism is about challenging sexism. The sexism, you know, especially sexism that women face. And I don't think that, you know, what sex I was assigned as a child changes the fact that I am treated as a woman and face sexism in my day-to-day life.
When they talk about that male privilege thing, they seem to forget that when you're living that old life and you get these privileges, they don't make you feel good. They mostly make you feel pretty bad about yourself. It's like, it's not like this thing that you're like totally on board with a lot of the time, at least in my experience. And on top of that, then you have all these other not so great, what do you call them, privileges of feeling awful about yourself and figuring out why you know, have depression, say, or any of these other things we have to face. It's, I don't know, like, TERFs are a sore spot for me, for sure.
Yeah, you joined the club, yes.
Right. So after this new book comes out, what is next for you?
So after this book comes out, the other writing project I have been working on is I've been writing fiction.
Mm-hmm.
I've been writing fiction under a pen name. The pen name is Cataclysm, cat with a K, and cataclysm like the world-ending word. And basically it touches on some of the subjects that come up in my writing, but it's mostly humorous and somewhat surreal. And Cataclysm is the protagonist. I'm writing a novel called 99 Erics, which is basically about the character Cataclysm writing a book called 99 Erics about her experiences dating 99 different people named Eric. It's more surreal than slutty. Not that there's anything wrong with slutty. is a byline of it. So anyway, I've been writing that, and that's been a lot of fun to do, and I'm probably 2/3-ish done that novel, and I don't know where or when it will appear out into the world, but I'm hoping to finish writing it by January. So
awesome.
We'll see.
You're also, though, you were in a rock band before, right? Bite Size. And now you still have your own solo project called Soft Vowel Sounds, right?
Yes. Yeah. So both of those are true. And people can find out about these on my website. But so Bite Size was a kind of an indie rock noise pop band I was in for quite a long while, basically from the late 90s until about the late zeros. And Soft Vowel Sounds, I only had the chance to record a 4-song EP, which people can find on the internet. And I plan to do more songs. I have more songs in the works, but just between juggling 2 book projects right now, I haven't had time for it yet. But hopefully once That's Spoken is out there in the world, I can have some time to work on that as well.
For sure. So we'll link everything, of course, in this the description of this video when it goes up. But for people who want to buy your books, read your essays, and also support what you do, where are the best places for them to go?
Yeah, so if you go to my website, so juliaserano.com, you'll find links to everything. There's a page, there's a buy stuff, buy Julia's books and music button that will take you to either links to buy my books elsewhere, or you can buy CDs or other music via Bandcamp as well. And if you also like the work I do, because I put a lot of my stuff, my essays, out there into the world for free, and if you like what I do, I also have recently joined Patreon, or Patreon, I don't know which way you say it.
I say it interchangeably.
What?
I say it interchangeably.
Okay, yeah. I've said Patreon, but then yesterday I heard someone say Patreon, and now I'm...
Well, there's patron, the word, but then there's also the word patronize, so it got pressed in for both, I suppose.
Yeah.
What's your Patreon handle, though?
Oh yeah, it's Julia Serano, one word.
Sure.
And also there are links to Patreon, my Patreon page on my website too, so you can go there. I also have other things. I have like on each page of my website at the top, along with the Patreon button, there's also YouTube. I have some of my Cataclysm readings there. I'm going to put up some of my old poems. Right now my poem Cocky is up on YouTube, but like me performing that slam poem, but I plan to put more of that up, and I hope to put up, there are a couple music videos, but I hope to put up more music too. So in the next year the YouTube page will grow, but for now there's some things up there too.
Awesome. It sounds like there's plenty of stuff for people to check out there. I guess we're basically hitting the hour here. It was really great to get to talk to you, Julia. It really means a lot that you came on. I'm sorry we didn't get to get a whole bunch of stuff. I want to ask you about your slam poetry more. Perhaps I'll have to have you come on again after your book comes out.
Okay, I would be open to that.
Awesome. Okay, well, perhaps I'll sign off here, guys. And Julia, you and I can stay on for a sec. We'll just wrap up offline. You guys can get this on YouTube after I post it, most likely tonight. You can find all the episodes compiled there on my channel, as well as on my website, lifeofbria.com. There's also my webcomics there. You can find me on Facebook as well under the, handle Sabrina Comics, and also on Twitter at Life of Bria. And all of this will be tweeted and posted. It'll be very easy to find. Please tune in next week. I'll be doing another live interview at the same bat time, same bat place or channel or whatever. But y'all have a great week, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.